At midnight, between May 5th and 6th, Bonaparte left Paris and rushed to the front to join the reserve army. The enemies of the Republic, still eager to seize power, closely monitored events and awaited, with great impatience, either a misstep by the first consul at the front or some government misfortune. Thus, when leaving the capital, the consul ordered an increase in the gendarmerie and imposed restrictions on the press. He entrusted the Council of State to combattre. Be firm. If anything happens, do not worry. I will come like lightning to punish the insolent ones who dare attempt to overthrow the government. By the night of May 8th, the first consul's cortege reached Geneva, where divisions from Vendée, Brittany, and Paris were converging. Several half-brigades remained stationed in Dijon, along with recruits and volunteers sent there to reinforce Austrian beliefs that the reserve army was a mere fiction. Meanwhile, on May 12th, near Lausanne, Bonaparte conducted a final review of the army before its push across the Alps. The possibility of launching this grand operation arose because General Moreau had finally begun his campaign on the Rhine. General Moreau was successful despite the fact that this happened with a significant delay. As expected, the great advance occurred near Schaffhausen. On May 3rd, near Stockach, the Austrians suffered a significant defeat. The French captured about 3,000 soldiers and seized 9 cannons. As a result, as anticipated, Krai began withdrawing toward Oem, giving Bonaparte the opportunity to cross the Alps without concern for his rear. After confirming Krai's retreat, Bonaparte ordered Moreau to ease the pressure on him and send Lucuap's corps into Switzerland. However, Moreau was unwilling to follow orders from others. He found reasons to ignore this command, and instead of sending Lucuap's seasoned corps, he assembled the least combat-ready units in his army, numbering barely over 10,000 men. This force was placed under General Mousset's command. Nonetheless, it provided at least some reinforcement for the 45,000-strong reserve army, which was about to undertake an extraordinarily challenging operation. Such Moreau's actions undoubtedly raised concerns for the first consul, but there was no turning back. The Genoa garrison urgently needed relief. Moreover, Bonaparte received more uplifting news than from Moreau these days. A letter arrived from his old comrade, Desaix, who had just escaped from Egypt and British captivity. By mid-May, the reserve army had passed Lausanne and was already near Martigny. Warehouses were established in Villeneuve, where grain, biscuits, oats, and other supplies were transported across Lake Geneva. The first consul, whose foresight never waned, even enlisted the monks of the ancient monastery atop the great Saint Bernard. Known for their piety and centuries-long tradition of aiding lost travelers, these hermits lived in complete seclusion. The first consul sent them 20,000 francs to help them stock up on provisions, as much as they could afford. The marching order through the passes was as follows. Lannes would lead the vanguard. This nearly 8,000-strong detachment was to cross the pass as quickly as possible and seize Aosta at all costs. Lannes' primary objective was to capture Ilia, controlling the valley's exit. The main body of troops would follow the vanguard through the Great St. Bernard. 3 auxiliary columns, setting out at one-day intervals, would cross via the Little St. Bernard, Simplon, and Moseny. Mousset's corps would pass through St. Gothard. It was decided to traverse the most dangerous sections at night when the temperature was lower and the risk of avalanches, which could bury entire battalions, was reduced. The hardest part of the route began beyond Martigny, where mountain paths with steep slopes and chasms along the edges began. These paths were completely impassable for wagons, especially artillery. Artillery Commander General Marmont employed 2 methods. The first method involved placing 8-pound cannons and mortars into specially hollowed-out logs. 100 men were harnessed to each piece, dragging them across the St. Bernard over 2 days. The second method used sleds. Gun carriages were disassembled and carried piece by piece. Ammunition chests and other loads were carried on the backs of men and mules. Thus, all preparations were complete, and in the pre-dawn hours of May 16th, Lannes' vanguard began crossing the Alps. Standing at the head of his brave detachment, Lannes addressed his troops. "Soldiers, forward with me. No fear. The first consul believes in your courage. Remember, as we advance against the enemy, our brothers in Genoa are suffering horrific hunger while waiting for us. Only we can bring them deliverance by marching through Piedmont and Lombardy at the pace of an attack." Lannes exceeded all expectations. He crossed the pass with ease. In just 14 hours, his troops covered over 25 miles of mountainous terrain. Only a few men fell into the abyss. By the end of the day, Lannes seized Aosta in a decisive assault. The following day, after waiting for Chabron's division to arrive via the Little St. Bernard Pass, Lannes moved further and defeated a 1,500-strong Austrian detachment at Châtillon. At the same time, the first consul was in Martigny, directing the entire operation while attempting to maintain communication with Genoa. Delays in the Rhine offensive and other circumstances forced him to reconsider the timing of the garrison's relief from the blockade. For this reason, an officer was sent to Genoa through General Suchet. Braving extraordinary dangers by sea in a small boat, he managed to slip into Genoa and deliver an oral message to General Masséna. The reserve army is on the march. They are crossing the Alps. The first consul requests that resistance be held until June 4th. Meanwhile, between May 16th and the 20th, the other divisions, with all their heavy equipment, began their ascent. As expected, transporting the artillery required enormous physical effort, yet the soldiers, displaying great courage, overcame the difficulties and steadily advanced. At dawn, everything was ready, and we were given biscuits. I strung them on a cord and hung them around my neck. Additionally, each of us received 2 pairs of shoes. In the evening, our artillerymen gathered their teams to pull the cannons. We traveled over 3 miles across these dreadful rocks, after which we had to rest and change shoes because those we wore had been completely shredded. Once we reached the fields of perpetual snow, our journey became easier. The cannon sleds slid faster across the snow, and nothing hindered us from reaching the monastery. We dragged 3 of our cannons there, and 400 grenadiers with their officers entered the house of God, where men filled with love for humanity lived to aid and comfort travelers. While our colonel and other officers warmed themselves by the fireplaces, these venerable monks gave us a bucket of wine for every 12 men, a quarter pound of Gruyere cheese, and a loaf of bread per soldier. These kind people did everything they could for us. In return, we shook the fathers' hands in farewell and embraced their dogs, which nuzzled us as if they had known us forever. Meanwhile, Lannes continued deeper into the Aosta Valley, which widened to reveal dwellings, trees, and cultivated fields. The soldiers were delighted to see this instead of snow-covered rocks. Cheerfully, the soldiers marched onward until the valley narrowed again and a menacing rock crowned with cannons appeared ahead. This was Fort Bard, blocking the valley. Its garrison consisted of 400 men and 26 guns, and the only road passed within musket range of the fort. Berthier and engineering officers soon arrived at the fort. A reconnaissance produced a grim conclusion. Storming the fortress was impossible due to the steep cliffs. The commandant rejected all negotiation offers. Lannes showed ingenuity by leading part of his forces along goat trails to bypass the fortress and move forward. Over the following days, several more divisions passed in single procession along the narrow path clinging to the mountainside. However, this route was entirely impractical for artillery, cavalry, and supply trains. Berthier was forced to halt all transport movements. Serious concerns arose that this desperate delay would ruin the entire timetable and jeopardize the offensive's success. If Milas had acted with proper speed, armed with this information that had likely already reached the Austrian headquarters, he could have halted the French invasion altogether. Upon learning of this obstacle, the first consul immediately left Martigny and, on May 20th, crossed the Great St. Bernard Pass with his aides and a special guide without much difficulty. After a brief stop at the monastery, he descended into the Aosta Valley and arrived at Fort Bard. quick action was imperative. After consulting with his officers, it was decided that they would drag the cannons through the fort under the cover of night, despite the enemy's fire. The artillerymen managed to move their guns through the town in complete darkness, nearly under the fort's guns. They laid straw mixed with manure along the streets and wrapped the wheels in rags so as not to make the slightest noise. Of the 30 cannoneers who dared to haul the guns this way, 7 were killed. The next night, they used the same method to drag 2 more 8-pound cannons and 2 howitzers. In total, 6 guns were transported this way. However, time was now more valuable than cannons, and it was decided to continue the advance into Italy with the artillery already available. Any additional guns would be captured from the Austrians in battle. Thus, leaving Chablon's division to force the fort's surrender, the main army rushed forward. During this time, Lannes pushed forward with vigor, carving his path with bayonets. On May 22nd, after a bloody battle, he finally captured Ivrea, driving out a 3,000-strong enemy force. Thus, Lannes had brilliantly completed his mission, and the exit from the defile was now under French control. By May 24th, other divisions began to converge on this point. These days, Milas's headquarters had been receiving a flood of reports that the French were breaking through all the Alpine passes. At first, he didn't pay much attention to them, believing these were only small detachments trying to divert him from Genoa. It was only on May 28th, when the French were approaching Turin, that Milas finally accepted the grim reality he had refused to believe. A full-fledged army led by Napoleon had appeared behind his lines. However, the French position was no less precarious. The army was still too dispersed. Fort Bard lay in their rear, and they had almost no artillery. So, as much as there was an urgent desire to relieve the Genoa garrison, caution was paramount. Any reckless move could doom the entire campaign. The first consul accurately assessed the situation and exercised the necessary restraint. He decided to slow down the advance on Genoa in order to ensure the successful and secure capture of Milan. A huge city could provide the army with much-needed resources. Additionally, there was hope that news would reach Genoa that the reserve army was already in the Piedmont plain, allowing Massena to hold out longer. Moreover, by capturing Milan, Bonaparte would sever Milas's communications along the northern bank of the river Po and open a path for Moset's corps, which had already crossed the St. Gothard and was nearing Milan. Thus, Bonaparte began masterful maneuvers in the Piedmont plain. After staging a diversion toward Turin, the army suddenly pivoted and moved to capture artillery from the enemy's main arsenal. Alarmed, Milas initially sent his troops toward Turin, but soon realized it was a feint and that the French were heading for Milan. Milas redirected his forces toward Piacenza to secure his communications on the southern bank of the river Po, but Bonaparte outpaced him in movements. On May 30th, Murat crossed the Ticino River, and by June 2nd, French vanguards had entered Milan. The city's inhabitants were so unprepared that they didn't immediately recognize those troops had arrived. The French confiscated more than 300 field and siege guns. The Milan garrison was blockaded, and Vukasovich's 10,000-strong division retreated beyond the Ada River. Thus, by sacrificing speed, Bonaparte reaped maximum rewards by taking Milan. Now it remained to link up with Moset's corps and launch a major offensive against Milas, who was tied down by the siege. Moreover, news arrived that Fort Bard had capitulated, giving Bonaparte full freedom of action. Everything seemed to be going absolutely perfectly, but suddenly everything changed. On June 5th, Murat took Piacenza and intercepted a packet containing Milas's latest dispatches. The news they carried was devastating. Genoa had fallen.